The man known to history as Reinhard Heydrich was born on the 7th of March 1904 in Halle an der Saale in the Saxony-Anhalt region of eastern Germany. His full name was Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich. His father was Richard Bruno Heydrich, a noted composer and opera singer of the time, who had named his eldest son Reinhard after the hero of his first opera entitled Amen, while Reinhard's middle names Tristan and Eugen were derived respectively from Richard Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde, and Eugen Kranz, the name of his maternal grandfather, the director of the Dresden Royal Conservatory. Reinhard's mother was Elisabeth Anna Kranz, the daughter of the aforementioned Eugen Kranz. Her background was affluent. She and Richard had met when he was a student at the Dresden Conservatory, which her father was director of at the time. Reinhard was the first of 3 children, with a younger boy, Heinz, arriving a year and a half later, followed by a daughter whom they called Maria. Reinhard's youth was one of relative privilege, growing up as the son of a noted composer who had also become the director of the Halle Conservatory of Music. Reinhard Heydrich, who went by his middle name Bruno, was a nationalist who instilled a love of Germany in his sons. Reinhard showed promise in many fields of endeavor from a young age. He was athletic and became a good swimmer, as well as an accomplished student. From his parents he developed an appreciation for classical music, and he played both the piano and the violin, the latter with some considerable ability. Yet there was also tribulation for Reinhard during these years. He was bullied at school, primarily on account of his supposed Jewish ancestry. Anti-Semitism was commonplace in much of Europe in the early 20th century, and the Heydrich family was said to have been descended from Jews. This supposition seems to have been arrived at by the marriage of Reinhard's paternal grandmother to a locksmith called Gustav Robert Süss in the 1870s. This man became Reinhard Heydrich's stepfather, so Reinhard was not actually his grandson in any event, and Süss was also a Protestant whose name simply sounded Jewish. Yet Reinhard was mocked by his peers in school as Moses Handel. Those taunts about his alleged Jewish ancestry would cast a long shadow over his psyche. Reinhard's youth and early teenage years were spent against the backdrop of war. At the time he was born, Europe had become a powder keg of political tensions between the great powers, fueled by nationalism, colonial competition in Africa, and the development of 2 armed military alliances. On one side was Germany, allied with the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and on the other were Britain, France, and Russia. Myriad regional conflicts across Europe and Africa perennially threatened to spill over into outright war. But these were often averted, that is, until the summer of 1914, when a political crisis arose in the Balkans, when the heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist. In the weeks that followed, what had started as a regional crisis ballooned into a continent-wide act of saber-rattling, and in early August 1914, this spilled over into a continent-wide war. The First World War had commenced, but it would not go well for Germany. After years of stalemate on the Western Front in northeastern France, in 1917 the United States entered the conflict on the side of Britain and France. This, along with political unrest at home in Germany, spelled the end of the German Empire, and in November 1918, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. The war was brought to an end, and a new German republic named after the town of Weimar was established, one which accepted cripplingly punitive peace terms through the Treaty of Versailles a year later. In the aftermath of the war, there was considerable unrest across Germany. Huge numbers of German workers, buoyed by the success of the socialist Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in late 1917, sought to pressure the new Weimar Republic into taking a more left-leaning pathway forward, while many on the right were violently opposed to them. A major incidence of this unrest occurred in Berlin in January 1919, when a large number of some 50,000 communists led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and calling themselves the Spartacists, rebelled in Berlin, threatening to take over the state. The Spartacist revolt was only crushed when the government armed tens of thousands of ex-soldiers, which became known as the Freikorps or Free Corps, who successfully suppressed the revolt on the 12th of January. The Freikorps became a staple of German life in the years that followed, being employed by the Weimar Republic to break up strikes and labor movements wherever they occurred. Though he had just turned 15 years of age, Heydrich was soon involved in a Freikorps detachment known as Merkers Volunteer Rifles in Halle, after the town was taken over by striking communists. This unit was substantially responsible for crushing the labor agitation in Halle in the spring of 1919. Heydrich would later claim that this period in 1919 was one in which his political sensibilities were significantly shaped. From the very beginning, those sensibilities were profoundly anti-Semitic. Prejudice against Jewish people was an all-too common phenomenon in Europe in the early 20th century, and indeed, Jewish communities across the continent had faced periodic persecution, pogroms, and expulsions in regions such as England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany, going all the way back to the Middle Ages. Heydrich's anti-Semitism was, therefore, unfortunately not uncommon in Weimar Germany, but the virulence of it was. In 1919, shortly after its establishment in Bamberg that spring, Heydrich joined the Deutsch-Völkischer Schutz- und Trutzbund, the German Nationalist Protection and Defiance Federation, a group whose motto was Deutschland den Deutschen, Germany for the Germans. From its inception, the federation was one of the most rabidly anti-Semitic movements within post-war Germany, a time when many people were at pains to suggest that the Jewish people were responsible for Germany's defeat in the war and humiliation ever since. It is hard to determine where Heydrich's own extreme anti-Semitism emerged from. Certainly his parents were not especially anti-Semitic, and his father had even rented out a small room in the Halle Conservatory to a local Jewish salesman in the 1910s. Rather, Heydrich's beliefs were shaped by the general growing anti-Semitic fervor within Germany of the post-war period. When he was just 18 years of age, Reinhard determined that he wished to join the German Navy. This was in itself not an easy position to obtain. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the newly created Reichsmarine was to be limited to just 15,000 Marines, while it could not have any submarines and was restricted to having no more than 6 Dreadnought-class battleships. But Heydrich's family's upper-middle-class background and connections ensured him an entry as a cadet at the Kiel Naval Base in northern Germany near the Danish border. By the spring of 1924, he had been promoted to the rank of senior midshipman, and from there he was dispatched to the officer training base at the Merwich Naval Base in Kiel. In 1926, he completed his training with a 6-month stint on the SMS Schleswig-Holstein, the flagship of the North Sea Fleet, before being sent on a training cruise to the Western Mediterranean, where he visited Spain and Portugal. Heydrich earned some plaudits during this time for having matured into a decent officer, and by the summer of 1928, he would rise to the rank of sub-lieutenant. And he was also ambitious. A childhood friend who met him during a brief return to Halle around this time noted that Heydrich had articulated his desire to become an admiral one day. As Heydrich was finding his sea legs, some signs of the future that might lay ahead for Germany were beginning to manifest in the south of the country, in Bavaria. The aftermath of the war had seen a great many German men feeling extremely discontented with the peace settlement. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles had required Germany to militarily disarm, retaining only an army of 100,000 men, while crippling war reparations were imposed on the country. When these were periodically not paid, the French occupied parts of Western Germany during the early 1920s. Many individuals were extremely bitter about this and had begun to join fringe political groups such as the Freikorps, as Heydrich himself had done in 1919. These movements continued into the 1920s with small political parties wishing for an overhaul of the post-war settlement and a reinvigoration of German national pride. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, led by an Austrian-born war veteran by the name of Adolf Hitler, was one such movement based in Bavaria. In November 1923, they would go so far in pursuit of their goals as to attempt a military uprising in the city of Munich, but this was over before it had ever really begun. Thereafter, Hitler and several others were arrested, but the government failed to destroy the party entirely, and they would re-emerge many years later as a political force, one which Heydrich would be drawn to. Heydrich's path towards the Nazi Party was in many ways brought about by his own failings within the Navy, and in particular the unrest which his extracurricular activity often created. As early as 1926, when he had been on tour in the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic, Heydrich had caused some unrest at a naval base when he became agitated after a British officer's wife refused to dance with him. By the late 1920s, he had garnered a reputation as a serial philanderer, involved in a string of affairs, often with married women, and often with multiple women simultaneously. Moreover, he had become, by some accounts, insufferably arrogant towards his subordinates, while his major attentions seemed to be focused on sports such as rowing rather than his naval duties. All of this came to a head early in 1931 when it was revealed that he had made a promise to one woman that he would marry her, and then proceeded to abandon that relationship in favor of Lina von Osten, the daughter of a minor German aristocrat whom Heydrich had met at a rowing ball in December 1930. A breach of promise of this kind was still a legal offense in some common law jurisdictions in the early 1930s, and it was considered serious enough that Heydrich was discharged from the Reichsmarine for conduct unbecoming an officer in April 1931. Heydrich's expulsion from the Reichsmarine in the spring of 1931 was a significant turning point in his life. He had, though, ultimately brought it on himself. Throughout the investigation into what had occurred between himself and the young woman, whose identity is strangely elusive and who had claimed Reinhard had proposed to her, he deliberately tried to deceive the investigative panel, which consisted of Admiral Gottfried Hansen, the commander of the Baltic Fleet, the training officer Gustav Kleikamp, and the senior-most member of Heydrich's crew, Hubertus von Wangenheim. Rather than accept responsibility for what had occurred, Heydrich claimed it was the woman who had initiated their relationship and pressured him. When this was found to be categorically false, Heydrich refused to come clean about his conduct, and it was this proven insincerity, as the investigative panel referred to it, which led them to take the drastic step of discharging him from the Navy. And Heydrich did not respond well. His future wife, Lina von Osten, later stated that it was the heaviest blow of his life, and that he spent days in his bedroom afterwards, crying in rage and self-pity. He even petitioned the German President Paul von Hindenburg to look into the matter, but to no avail. Perhaps given the psychological blow that all this constituted, it is unsurprising to find that within weeks he would embark on a completely different career trajectory, one which would dominate the remainder of his life and would have fearful consequences for huge sections of the population of Central and Eastern Europe in the years that followed. While Heydrich's rapid ascent within the Navy and equally rapid downfall in the late 1920s and early 1930s was occurring, the country's politics was beginning to take a sharp turn. During the mid-1920s, Germany's political landscape had stabilized on the back of good economic growth, which reflected the global economy during the so-called Roaring Twenties. But much of this international growth was based on speculative investment, and in the autumn of 1929, the stock markets on Wall Street in New York began to cool, with huge losses being incurred. This was the beginning of a Great Depression across the economies of the Americas and Europe. Germany was hit particularly badly, and by the early 1930s, millions of people had lost their jobs and their life savings. As often happens in such times, extremist parties were able to exploit the unrest towards their own ends. One such party in Germany were the Nazis, who had previously attempted a military putsch under their leader Adolf Hitler in Munich back in 1923. Previously, they had been a pathetic outfit who would garner little more than 2% of the national vote, but in the Reichstag elections of September 1930, they won 18% of the vote, and became the second largest party in Germany. They would continue to grow in popularity in the years that followed by exploiting the resentment and despair of the German people at the economic situation. Heydrich was soon involved with the Nazis. Politically, they were akin to the Deutsch-Völkische Schutz- und Trutzbund, of which he had been a member back in the early 1920s, with a striking anti-Semitic stance and a belief in Germany being for what they deemed as ethnically German people, a nationalist orientation which they conceived of along racial lines. When he met her in December 1930, Lina von Osten had already been a member of the Nazi Party for some time, having joined over a year earlier in 1929. Heydrich almost certainly did not need much convincing, but she was probably a significant figure in influencing him to join the party himself on the 1st of June 1931, the day after his expulsion from the Reichsmarine was formalized. 6 weeks later, he also joined the Schutzstaffel, or SS, meaning Protective Echelon, one of two major paramilitary wings of the Nazi Party, the other being the SA, or Stormtroopers. Under its leader, Heinrich Himmler, the SS would grow to become a major power within Germany. Heydrich was listed as member number 10,120 and Nazi Party member number 544,916. The following 26th of December 1931, he and Lina were married. They would go on to have 4 children, Klaus, Heide, Silke, and Martha, born variously between 1933 and 1942 into what was a committed Nazi family. Heydrich's life trajectory had taken a major shift in the course of 1931, but he was now without formal employment, although the terms of his discharge from the Reichsmarine had included severance pay for 2 years. While he was still living off this pay, a job found him, and it came from within the Nazi Party. Around the time that Heydrich had joined both the party and the SS in the summer of 1931, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, had been looking to establish a counterintelligence branch for the paramilitary organization, one which could act against centrist and leftist groups seeking to block the rise to power of the Nazis. Shortly after Heydrich joined the SS, he was recommended to Himmler as somebody who could carry out a senior role within this new counterintelligence unit by Karl von Eberstein, a native of Halle himself, whose mother was Heydrich's godmother. He was also friends with Heydrich's soon-to-be wife Lina, and so was happy to facilitate the meeting between Himmler and Heydrich. This duly occurred in Munich, at which Himmler was sufficiently impressed that he hired Heydrich as the chief of the new SS IC service, or intelligence service, although it is better known by its later name, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, meaning security service. The new position required Heydrich to relocate to Munich with Lina within days of his accepting the offer. By the 1st of August 1931, he was operating out of the Braun House, a mansion on Königsplatz in Munich, which the Nazis had purchased in 1930 as their new headquarters. The position was challenging at first, with Heydrich having to share a typewriter with another member of the SS and receiving low pay, but over time, conditions improved. Much of Heydrich's work was spent monitoring Nazi Party members. The rapid expansion of the party in the late 1920s and early 1930s had created fears that many new members and even some Reichstag deputies had either joined as career opportunists with little ideological belief in the Nazis, or that the party was possibly being infiltrated by state security figures or members of the Communist Party. And in tandem, the SD was charged with making preparations to begin infiltrating the state security apparatuses itself. By late 1931, Heydrich was overseeing a network of spies for both these endeavors and had begun gathering intelligence dossiers on centrist politicians to attempt to blackmail or exploit them in the years ahead. Himmler was more than satisfied with this early work, and when Heydrich married Lina in December, the head of the SS marked the occasion by promoting Heydrich to the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major. Heydrich was rising within the party which was about to ascend to power within Germany. With the national economic situation looking ever more ominous, Reichstag elections were called for the summer of 1932. In these, the Nazis nearly doubled their vote on the 1930 election, gaining 37% and winning 230 seats out of the 608-seat parliament, making them the largest political party in Germany. However, the more centrist parties were determined to prevent Hitler from becoming Chancellor of Germany, and Hitler was unwilling to join a coalition government in a junior role. As a result, a government was cobbled together led by Chancellor Franz von Papen, but it too could do little to address the economic and political crisis, and fresh elections in November 1932 failed to break the stalemate. It was in this impasse that a broad coalition of centrists and business elements within Germany agreed to a deal with the Nazis in January 1933, whereby Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany and the Nazis would be given a number of ministerial briefs. The idea was to stabilize the country's politics and keep Hitler under control, but this proved entirely elusive. Within weeks, a political emergency had been concocted by the Nazis following a fire at the Reichstag, and this was used to pass an enabling act in late March 1933, which effectively allowed Hitler to rule by decree. The Weimar Republic was dead. Heydrich could have expected to occupy a relatively senior position within the security apparatuses of the new state, but his entire existence within the Nazi Party had become threatened in 1932 as the party was making its final push for power. That year, claims about Heydrich's partial Jewish ancestry, the ones which had seen him taunted for being Moses Handel back in school in Halle, resurfaced. This was a serious claim to be leveled against any Nazi Party member, but it was especially inflammatory for a high-ranking member of the SS, a group which prided itself on its allegedly unimpeachable credentials as an organization of pure-blooded German Aryans, one whose goal was to ensure the racial purity of Germany going forward. The claims against Heydrich were politically motivated and originated amongst party members whom he had antagonized through his counterintelligence work in the years since he had joined the SD, but they proved ineffective. By the autumn of 1932, Heydrich had been cleared of the charge of racial impurity after an investigation by Achim Gerke, the Nazi Party's chief investigator of such matters, and was even promoted by Himmler again as chief of the SD. With the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazi Party early in 1933, and with the charges of racial impurity having been overcome, the path was clear for Heydrich to rise swiftly within the security apparatuses of the new Nazi state. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Himmler and Heydrich oversaw the establishment of the Bavarian Political Police, whereby the police services in Munich and other towns of southern Germany were effectively placed under the control of the SS and the SD. In the weeks and months that followed, Heydrich, with a growing number of officials working under him, began developing a card index of the regime's political opponents throughout Bavaria, be they trade union activists and labor organizers, Jewish leaders, journalists who were vocally opposed to the Nazis, communists, or any other kind of overt enemy of the Nazi regime. In tandem, he and Himmler were to move to the forefront in establishing a new concentration camp near Dachau, outside Munich, where such political opponents were subsequently detained. These concentration camps became an all too familiar sight across Germany in the mid-1930s, effectively being a temporary prison constructed like an army barracks and with thousands of individuals being detained there, often without any legitimate legal basis for their detention. These developments in Bavaria were not isolated in Germany. In Prussia, the largest region in Germany, dominating much of the north and east of the country, the Nazi minister and senior official Hermann Göring had set up the Geheime Staatspolizei, meaning secret state police, to act as a version of the SD in Prussia. It is more infamously known by its abbreviated name, the Gestapo. Much of this had to do with senior Nazi officials such as Göring and Himmler trying to carve out their own blocks of power within the new Nazi state in 1933 and 1934. Thus, when the Reich Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick tried to begin amalgamating these disparate police forces into a national police service early in 1934, Göring was initially reluctant, feeling that Himmler was trying to outflank him and take over the Gestapo. However, by the late spring his interests were being drawn elsewhere, notably his desire to oversee the creation of a new German air force, and he reluctantly agreed on the 20th of April 1934 to allow Himmler to take control of the Gestapo. 2 days later, Himmler appointed Heydrich head of the organization. With this, Heydrich was now effectively the head of both the SD and the Gestapo, making him the most senior counterintelligence and secret police official in the entire country. In this newly found position of power, Heydrich was immediately charged with a senior role in efforts to crush one of the paramilitary wings of the Nazi Party. The Sturmabteilung, or SA meaning Storm Detachment, had grown to an immense size in the course of the early 1930s under its leader Ernst Röhm. By 1934, it consisted of over 2 million members known as stormtroopers, though that number could be accounted to be as high as 2 to 3.5 million members if the SS and other groups which were technically subordinate to it were included. Röhm's perception of his own power within the Nazi regime had grown in tandem, and he had become increasingly insubordinate towards Hitler and others. In the late spring of 1934, just as Himmler and Heydrich were wresting control of the Gestapo from Göring, Hitler determined to act. Heydrich was pivotal in drawing up a list of leading SA figures who would need to be purged in order to neuter the organization. Then, on the 30th of June 1934, a series of attacks, which have become known as the Night of the Long Knives, were launched. Röhm was arrested and executed without trial, along with nearly 200 others. In the months that followed, the SA was substantially neutralized, largely being turned into a sporting organization, while Himmler's SS was henceforth ascendant as the primary military wing of the Nazi Party. Heydrich's power was immense in the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives. Himmler was now the head of the SS and the German police services, and Heydrich was effectively his second-in-command, with direct control over the SD and the Gestapo. Thus, while Himmler was the ostensible head, Heydrich actually ran the operations. In the course of the mid-1930s, he developed a highly sophisticated state security apparatus, one based on a more elaborate version of the card index system he had developed in Munich several years earlier. Through this method, hundreds of thousands of alleged political dissidents were monitored, and many thousands were arrested and detained without charge in the growing system of concentration camps which had emerged across Germany to house enemies of the Nazi regime. Heydrich was also developing a network of individuals in charge of regional bases who were loyal to him. Notable amongst these were Heinrich Müller, a former police detective from Bavaria, whom Heydrich brought on as a senior official in Munich, and Adolf Eichmann, a fastidious bureaucrat who joined the SD in 1934, charged with monitoring the activities of the Freemasons and other suspected groups within Germany. These two would play a significant role in future events that Heydrich was front and center to. While Heydrich was rising within the German security services in the 1930s, the Nazi state was preparing for war. Hitler and his associates had come to power in 1933 with the express goal of launching a new European war to reassert German power on the continent. They were aware that it would be many years before this could be undertaken, such was the weakened state of the country militarily, and had originally envisaged such a war being undertaken from 1941 or 1942 onwards. To this end, the Nazis began secretly expanding German military immediately in 1933, and then in early 1935 announced publicly that they were breaching the caps which had been placed on the German military through the Treaty of Versailles by recruiting over 250,000 men into the German army and establishing a new German air force called the Luftwaffe. In tandem, Germany's industrial capacity to produce weapons, tanks, and ammunition was slowly increased, and the Allied powers of Britain and France largely allowed this to happen, believing enough time had elapsed since the First World War that Germany should be allowed to rearm to some extent. Even when the Nazis reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland in the spring of 1936, little complaint was heard. But graver problems lay not far ahead. As this march towards war was occurring in the 1930s, the Nazi regime was also beginning to aggressively actualize its anti-Semitic rhetoric. In the mid-1930s, the Nazi state's main goal was to politically disenfranchise the roughly 500,000 Jews who called Germany home, with the goal of either making these Jewish people second-class citizens or coercing them into leaving Germany altogether, perhaps to immigrate to the Holy Land, where efforts had been underway since the late 19th century to establish communities of Jewish people from across the world. This campaign of intimidation and political oppression culminated in 1935 with the so-called Nuremberg Laws, which, amongst other measures, prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews in Germany and restricted both the employment and economic opportunities of Jewish people across the country. From early on in these events, the SD and the Gestapo were central to identifying Germany's Jewish people and developing databases on anyone who was deemed to be particularly subversive from amongst the country's Jewish community. Thus, by the mid-1930s, Heydrich was playing a central role in the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi state, one which would intensify in the years that followed. By 1936, Heydrich had risen to become a very significant figure within the new Nazi state. Not only was he one of the most senior individuals within the security services, but this was reflected in a growing social, economic, and political status. The Heydrichs were increasingly invited to social gatherings at the Reichschancellery, where he began to develop a direct relationship with Hitler. The Führer was impressed by Heydrich's seeming uncompromising loyalty to the regime and willingness to execute even the most brutal of policies. Eventually, the German Chancellor would come to refer to Heydrich as the man with the iron heart, a macabre term of endearment. This aside, throughout his career, Heydrich's position was always based on his personal relationship with Himmler. Because of his dual positions as head of the SD and the Gestapo, Heydrich was technically a member of the German Privy Council from the spring of 1934 onwards, while in March 1936 he was elected as a member of the German Reichstag, albeit after the spring of 1933 it was a largely ceremonial parliament. In tandem with this career advancement, he also began to earn a significant salary, and the wider Heydrich family was able to benefit from Reinhardt's political connections. During the Summer Olympics, which were held in Berlin in 1936, the family were provided with their own private box. Thus, despite their marriage being in trouble privately, owing to possible infidelities by both Reinhardt and Lina, the Heydrichs had become one of the most prominent families in Berlin during the mid to late 1930s, based on Reinhardt's seemingly unwavering dedication to the Nazi state and its brutal ideologies. Heydrich's area of activity was also beginning to expand beyond the borders of Germany itself. After the country had rearmed in the mid-1930s, there was a growing thirst to bring parts of what was perceived to be a Greater Germany under Nazi rule. This included Austria and also parts of Czechoslovakia, notably the Sudetenland, which was home to 3 million ethnically German people. Efforts to bring Austria under German control had been underway since 1933, when the Austrian branch of the Nazis had applied extensive pressure on the government in Vienna to try to claim power, eventually culminating in the assassination of the Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss in 1934. His successor, Kurt Schuschnigg, had established a nationalist government which sought to keep Austria independent from Germany and effectively prohibited Nazism in Austria to that end. As a result, throughout the mid-1930s, Germany, along with a large body of Austrian Nazis operating from southern Germany, were attempting to subvert the Austrian state. Heydrich became central to these efforts by collecting data on public sentiment in Austria, organizing Nazi demonstrations there, and distributing clandestine Nazi propaganda throughout Austria, which emphasized the common German ancestry of Austrians and Germans. Eventually, all of this work bore fruit. By early 1938, Schuschnigg faced mounting public pressure within Austria to legalize the Nazi Party and consider the Anschluss, the union of Austria with Germany. Thus he declared that a referendum on the matter would be held on the 13th of March 1938, and Heydrich would play a part in this. For instance, when Schuschnigg met with Hitler for negotiations in Bavaria early in 1938, military and police figures such as Heydrich were asked to attend in order to intimidate the Austrian Chancellor. Schuschnigg's subsequent agreement to hold the referendum on unity with Germany simply provoked further aggression, and German troops were sent into Austria on the 12th of March, allegedly to ensure that the referendum was conducted in a fair manner. It was passed with an overwhelming majority, and Austria was joined with Germany that spring. Himmler and Heydrich were on a plane to Vienna immediately, landing there on the 13th, and holding court in the Hotel Regina in central Vienna over the next 2 days, where they organized the policing services in Austria, now that it was part of the German Reich, with Austrian Nazis such as Kurt de Lüge and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Before they had left the city, Heydrich had ordered the arrests of thousands of political opponents of the new Nazi regime across Austria. A similar process would play out in Czechoslovakia once the country came under German overlordship. This process was more complicated than that which occurred in Austria. Because Czechoslovakia had been formed as a new country in the aftermath of the First World War, and because the Nazis had displayed enough aggression in remilitarizing and annexing Austria, Britain and France were determined to prevent a German takeover of Czechoslovakia. Thus, when Hitler began pressing German claims to the Sudetenland in the autumn of 1939, a conference was held at Munich, whereat the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain conceded that Germany could annex the Sudetenland only if it promised to respect Czech independence beyond the ethnically German region. No sooner had this concession been made than Hitler was working on plans for the annexation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia early in 1939. Again, Heydrich was central to these developments, with plans for an invasion of Czechoslovakia detailing how the SD would follow the German army into the country to arrest perceived enemies of the state there such as communists, social democrats, and other opponents of the Nazis. This plan was never initiated as Czechoslovakia was annexed in March 1939 without any real conflict, but the plan itself is indicative of how central to the aggressive German expansion the SD and other security services headed by Heydrich had become. Much of the operations being conducted by the SD and Gestapo in Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939 focused on immediately identifying the Jewish people that lived in both jurisdictions and persecuting them. For instance, in May 1938, Heydrich directed the Gestapo to arrest nearly 2,000 Jews in Vienna on the basis that they had prior criminal convictions, many of them years old and entirely trivial. By November that year, upwards of 5,000 Austrian Jews had been forcibly deported from the country, largely through the ministrations of the SD and Gestapo. And this was just one part of how Heydrich's role in the Nazi state's anti-Semitic policies was expanding in the late 1930s. Another clear sign of this was seen in Germany on the night of the 9th of November 1938, when a huge wave of attacks was initiated against Jewish people and Jewish businesses across the country. By the end of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, hundreds of Jewish people had been killed and millions of Reichsmarks of damage had been inflicted on Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues. Again, Heydrich was central to events. At a gathering of Nazi leaders in Munich shortly before the pogroms started, Heydrich had assured other leading members of the party that the state security services would not intervene if attacks on Jewish businesses broke out in an apparently spontaneous fashion. Heydrich's role in Kristallnacht cannot be understated. The Nazi regime was determined to make the wave of violence which swept across Germany on the 9th of November 1938 seem like a popular movement, one which was driven by ordinary Germans rather than being directed by the Nazi state itself. Central to this was ensuring that the state security services did not intervene and, in fact, made preparations for interventions against the Jewish victims rather than the tens of thousands of perpetrators. Thus, just hours after the violence began, Heydrich had telegrammed Müller in Berlin, who was his deputy in charge of the Gestapo by this time, and stated that attacks on Jewish businesses and synagogues were not to be hindered, and state police were instead to prepare for the arrest of between 20,000 and 30,000 Jews. Thus, Heydrich was central to the pogrom that followed. To get a sense of it, in Vienna, a city that historically had a large Jewish community, 42 synagogues alone in the city were burned down that night, and 2,000 Jewish families were evicted from their homes. The state security services which Heydrich oversaw across Germany and Austria intervened only to arrest Jewish people. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men in total were arrested that night and in the days that followed, and shipped off to the concentration camps where more than 1,000 died, owing to the conditions of their imprisonment in the year that followed. All of this was indicative of a growing extremity to the Nazi state's approach towards the Jewish people living under its rule, and also of Heydrich's increasingly central role in the rabid anti-Semitic policies of Hitler and his followers. This would continue in the months that followed to the extent that Heydrich would become one of the central architects of the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, which followed in the early 1940s. By early 1939, the broad parameters of Heydrich's role within the Nazi state had solidified. He was, in effect, the senior figure within the police services, running day-to-day operations in the SD, holding a large amount of control over the Gestapo, which Müller had been appointed to run directly, and answerable effectively only to Himmler within the security apparatuses of the state. Moreover, his roles in the Nazi regime's evolving and increasingly brutal attitudes towards the Jewish population and in administering recently conquered and incorporated regions had been revealed to be pivotal by the Anschluss of Austria and the events of Kristallnacht. All of this was important, for the Nazis were now on a collision course with Britain and France. Following the intervention in Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939, Hitler began pressing claims to much of Poland on the basis that land had been taken from the German Reich when the new state of Poland was formed in 1918. However, this time, London and Paris were determined to resist further German aggression and made it clear that any violation of Polish sovereignty would result in war. And that is what eventually happened. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, 1 week after agreeing a deal with the Soviet Union for the division of Eastern Europe between the two powers, and just days after conducting a false flag operation to make Poland look like the aggressor, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Nazi Germany on the 3rd of September. The Second World War had commenced. The outbreak of the war had an immediate consequence for the arrangement of Germany's security services and Heydrich's position within them. To better manage the increasing amount of people and land which was being administered by the Nazis, a new body, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, meaning the Reich Security Main Office, was established with the stated goal of fighting all enemies of the Reich within and beyond the borders of Germany. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or RSHA, was formally created on the 27th of September 1939. Just as Germany's armies were finalizing their conquest of Poland. The new body would have oversight of the SD, the Gestapo, the Kripo or criminal police, and a number of other security services. Heydrich was appointed as its first chief. Additionally, the RSHA was broken down into 7 offices, which would oversee matters such as ideological investigation in Department 2 and suppression of crime in Department 5. The Gestapo was incorporated into Department 4, where a sub-department, B4, was created to oversee Jewish affairs and evacuation. Adolf Eichmann, who had begun working under Heydrich years earlier, was placed in charge of this branch of the RSHA, which would become significant in the months to come. The early stages of the Second World War went exceptionally well for Hitler and the Nazis. Poland's army was no match for the Germans and the Soviets, who moved in from the east just a few weeks after Germany as a part of a non-aggression pact, which had been signed between the two powers to divide up Eastern Europe. Thus, by October 1939, much of Poland was under German control, and a general government was set up here to administer the country for the Nazis. The conquest of Poland, and indeed the earlier extension of German authority over regions such as Czechoslovakia and Hungary, vastly expanded the number of Jewish people who were now in harm's way from the Nazi regime. In the Middle Ages, much of Europe's Jewish population had migrated to Poland after facing persecution in Western and Central Europe. Consequently, by the 20th century, Poland was home to some 3.5 million Ashkenazi Jews. By comparison, there had been just over 500,000 Jewish people in Germany when the Nazis came to power in 1933. All of this changed the face of the Nazis' Jewish policies. The question now was whether the same policy of intimidation would be employed in order to force the emigration of these Jewish people out of Nazi-held territory, or whether something much more sinister would be devised by the Nazi regime in Eastern Europe. Heydrich would be central to the so-called Jewish question from the very beginning of the occupation of Poland in the autumn of 1939. This was increasingly in conjunction with Adolf Eichmann, who had been assigned to Jewish affairs in Department 4 of the Reich Security Main Office. Eichmann had a particular skill for identifying and cataloguing huge numbers of people, a skill that was useful for a government obsessed with identifying all of the Jewish people living within its borders, in an age before computer databases were available. This was an especially difficult task in late 1939, as the Jewish population of Poland was so large. At this early stage of the war, the same policy of oppression of the Jewish people in order to coerce them into leaving the Reich altogether was generally also favored here. To that end, hundreds of thousands of Jews were being recorded at this time, and many were forced into ghettos and other restricted areas in cities such as Warsaw. While the Nazi state deliberated on a more concrete policy, Eichmann, with Heydrich's tacit approval, was promoting a plan to possibly deport millions of Europe's Jews to the East African island of Madagascar as a solution to the supposed Jewish question. But eventually, something much more heinous would be decided upon, and Heydrich would be absolutely central in its implementation when it occurred. It was not only the Jewish people who were suffering in Poland from Heydrich's actions there, however. In the early stages of the war, he was largely responsible for overseeing Operation Tannenberg, an initiative that was directed against Poles who were deemed to be enemies of the Nazi regime. Lists of such individuals had been drawn up by the SD even before the invasion of Poland commenced, and when the Germans occupied the country in September 1939, thousands of individuals were arrested, notably politicians who had been vocal in their opposition to the Nazis in Germany, artists and members of the intelligentsia, scholars, prominent members of the Roman Catholic Church, which was seen as a probable lightning rod for opposition to the regime, former Polish police officers, military personnel, and many others. Some of this resulted in mass executions which became known as the Intelligenzaktion or intelligentsia mass shootings. In total, it is estimated that a minimum of 100,000 Poles were killed or interred as a result of Operation Tannenberg. Some of this even involved mass murdering the patients of Polish hospitals. Heydrich would have been guilty of abominable war crimes just for overseeing Operation Tannenberg in the autumn and early winter of 1939. But much worse was to follow in time. The range of Heydrich's actions as head of the Reich Security Main Office expanded as the war spread across Europe. Following the conquest of Poland in the autumn of 1939, Hitler turned his attention to Northern and Western Europe in 1940, conquering Denmark and Norway in stealth operations in the spring, and then launching a blistering military assault on northern France and the Low Countries in the early summer. After 6 weeks of blitzkrieg, the feared lightning war, Nazi flags were flying in Brussels, Amsterdam, and Paris, and Britain stood alone in Europe against the Nazi tide. Months of attacks on Britain from the air and attempts to cut the country off through a submarine campaign against the country's merchant navy followed, but Britain refused to capitulate, and its longevity proved decisive. Eventually, Hitler tired of the British effort and decided from late 1940 onwards that Germany would invade the Soviet Union, with whom it had earlier signed a non-aggression pact, by which the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, and Hitler effectively carved Eastern Europe up between them. Now, in the summer of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in what was the largest military campaign ever undertaken, and initially it was very successful, bringing huge swathes of additional territory in eastern Poland, the Baltic, and Ukraine under German control by the autumn of 1941. This new rapid expansion of the German Reich across Western and Northern Europe in 1940 and throughout Eastern Europe in 1941 massively extended the remit of Heydrich's Reich Security Main Office, and in turn the level of atrocities which it was responsible for. One of the most heinous was its oversight of the Einsatzgruppen. These deployment groups or task groups were basically SS death squads, which had first been deployed in Poland as part of Operation Tannenberg. They took their orders from Himmler, but Heydrich oversaw much of their activity as head of the Reich Security Main Office and Himmler's unofficial deputy leader of the SS. In 1941, their conduct became incredibly brutal. The Einsatzgruppen followed closely behind the front lines of the German army as it advanced into Ukraine and Russia, engaging in mass executions of Jews, Russian and Ukrainian prisoners of war, Romani people, and supposed political dissidents. At Babi Yar, near the city of Kiev, some 33,000 Jews were massacred by the Einsatzgruppen in less than 48 hours on the 29th and 30th of September 1941. Many similar incidents occurred on the Eastern Front throughout Heydrich's tenure as head of the Reich Security Main Office, and by the end of the war, the Einsatzgruppen had killed upwards of 2 million people. Another instrument of state terror that Heydrich was heavily involved in was the Night and Fog Decree. This was a measure whereby individuals in occupied territories could be arrested and detained effectively without any legal basis if they were judged to be a danger to the Nazi state. The name of the decree, which was formally implemented in December 1941, was derived from a statement within it that such people should be arrested under the secrecy of night and fog. Often people detained in this way simply vanished from parts of Europe such as occupied France or the Low Countries, and their families had no idea what had happened to them. In many instances, the unfortunate victims, of whom there were thousands in the years that followed, were taken secretly to Germany, where they were processed through Heydrich's SD office and then interrogated. Often such individuals were tortured to make them reveal details of whatever conspiracy against the state they were believed to be involved in, and in many instances killed or sent to the concentration camps, the latter of which was often the same as a death sentence. In this way, thousands of citizens of occupied Western Europe, a region that was generally spared the worst horrors of the Nazi regime that were being carried out in Eastern Europe, fell prey to Heydrich's machinations as head of the security services of the Reich. However, the thing which Heydrich is most remembered for today is the very prominent role he played in the development of the Nazi state's response to what they termed the Jewish question. As we have seen, Germany's attitudes towards its Jewish communities had shifted over time. In the mid-1930s, efforts had been made to disenfranchise Jewish people across Germany by stripping them of their citizenship and restricting their economic and social freedoms, all with the goal of pressurizing the 500,000 Jews who lived in Germany into emigrating. This campaign of intimidation became more sinister with the Kristallnacht pogroms of November 1938, while the exponential increase in the number of Jewish people living under Nazi rule following the conquest of Poland in September 1939 had seen individuals such as Eichmann working on bizarre schemes to deport all of Europe's Jews to Madagascar, where they would live in a kind of giant open-air prison. But as lurid as the Madagascar plan was, it seemed relatively benign by comparison with the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, which was being worked out by Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and others in the course of 1941 as the invasion of Russia was commencing. The final solution was devised in response to an increasing awareness that it would prove impossible to remove millions of Jews from the German Third Reich. particularly so once the campaign against Britain in North Africa stalled and the possibility of seizing the Suez Canal, and with it a naval route to Madagascar, was impeded. Accordingly, in the summer of 1941, it was determined that the entire Jewish population of countries like Germany, Austria, Poland, and the Baltic states would be identified by Eichmann's office in Department 4 of the Reichssecurity Main Office, and then, using all of the resources controlled by Heydrich, they would be forcibly brought to the network of dozens of concentration camps which had been created across Central and Eastern Europe. There, some would be selected to work as slave labor for several months, until they were effectively worked to death, while the majority would be executed on arrival, typically by exposure to lethal chemical gases such as Zyklon B. This final solution would be carried out most extensively at a number of camps whose names, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, have become infamous. Those Jews who lived in the Soviet Union would largely be murdered by the Einsatzgruppen as the German armies advanced eastward. Heydrich was a party to these plans from the beginning. There is a lack of paperwork with which to establish the exact timeline of who knew what and when in relation to the evolution of the final solution, but a memo from Hermann Göring to Heydrich dated the 31st of July 1941 gave authorization to Heydrich to issue orders to the heads of various government departments in Germany and the occupied territories if those orders were in line with carrying out the final solution. Despite the particulars of what was going to occur having all been decided upon by the early autumn of 1941, it was not until the winter of that year that details of it were provided to a wider range of officials. When this task was assigned, it was given to Heydrich, who along with Müller and Eichmann organized a conference which was held at an SS-owned villa in the suburb of Wannsee outside Berlin on the 20th of January 1942. This was attended by some of the senior bureaucrats in charge of the government departments which would be involved in carrying out the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, by identifying those who would be murdered and organizing for their transport to the death camps. It is a striking statement about Heydrich's centrality to the Holocaust that he was placed in charge of organizing and running the Wannsee Conference. Historians have long debated what the significance of the Wannsee Conference actually was. We know, for instance, that the final solution had been arrived at months earlier by Hitler, Himmler, and others, and indeed that experiments which aimed at selecting the gases that would be used to carry out the mass executions had been conducted at concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau as early as the autumn of 1941. So nothing was actually decided upon at the house in the southwestern suburbs of Berlin on the 20th of January 1942. Rather, the significance of Wannsee lies in the fact that the decisions which had been made months earlier were now being put into operation. In bringing together some of the most senior bureaucrats of the Third Reich, Heydrich aimed to ensure that the cogs of the genocidal policy turned smoothly once measures were initiated in the weeks that followed. What is particularly striking about this is the manner in which genocide and mass murder could present themselves as a piece of bureaucracy, where individuals who largely sat behind desks in Berlin organizing trains, moving personnel between different camps, and filling out paperwork were the ones who, in the end, oversaw the murder of millions of Europe's Jews. At the top of that bureaucratic pyramid, at the outset of the Holocaust, was Reinhard Heydrich. It was not all abominable desk work for Heydrich, much to Himmler's regular disapproval. Back in 1935, when Göring had first started rebuilding the German Air Force into what would become the Luftwaffe, Heydrich had begun training as a pilot and had intermittently continued doing so throughout the second half of the 1930s, eventually completing his training at the flight school at Werneuchen northeast of Berlin in 1939 as the war was just beginning. Himmler was adamant that such a senior figure within the SS should not be flying combat missions, and initially forbade Heydrich from doing so once the war broke out. But as the fighting continued into the early 1940s, Heydrich became insistent and was assigned to the Norwegian front in the spring of 1940, where he served for a month as part of the Jagdgeschwader 77. This was a relatively safe theatre of war, but his decision in the summer of 1941 to join the German Air Force in its operations on the Eastern Front following the invasion of the Soviet Union was altogether more hazardous, and so it proved. Heydrich was shot down by flak anti-air guns when flying over the Dniester River in central Ukraine on the 22nd of July 1941. Despite crash landing in enemy territory, he made it back to the German lines and from there to Berlin. When he did, he received an express command from Hitler that he was not to fly again. While Heydrich had been permanently grounded following his brief period of active duty on the Eastern Front, he was soon being employed in a new fashion which took him away from his main duties as head of the Reichssecurity Main Office and the SD. In September 1941, he was appointed Deputy Reich Protector of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The Protectorate had been established in March 1939 following the virtual annexation of Czechoslovakia by Germany. At that time, the country was dismembered into different parts, the Sudetenland, for instance, having been entirely annexed by Germany in late 1938. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was one of the new entities. It basically consisted of the region around what is now the Czech Republic or Czechia and included the city of Prague. With a population of some 7.5 million people, a considerable economic output and a significant geographical location in the center of the Reich, the Protectorate was an important colony of the Reich during the war years. It was ruled by a protector or viceroy who was appointed by Hitler and governed the region in Germany's interest. However, the protector from 1939, Konstantin von Neurath, was perceived as being too moderate, and anti-German sentiment and resistance to Nazi rule had been growing there in the early 1940s. For this reason, a decision was taken in the autumn of 1941 to appoint Heydrich as von Neurath's deputy and the all-but governor of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. If Hitler wanted a more stringent viceroy to represent him, he picked the right individual. When he arrived to Prague, Heydrich was determined to crack down severely on any form of political dissidence. Von Neurath was an old-school conservative diplomat with little affinity for the Nazis. He had been selected as protector of Bohemia and Moravia in the spring of 1939, as the war had not yet erupted, and Hitler wanted somebody who was a moderate and was acceptable to some of Europe's heads of state. He had been commensurately lenient in his methods. A particular issue was the widespread proliferation of communist literature by the Czech resistance. Heydrich was determined to show his new subjects that he was the direct opposite from day one. Thus, martial law was immediately imposed by Heydrich following his arrival at Prague on the 27th of September, and the following morning he had the flags of the SS raised above the turrets of Prague Castle. In the days that followed, he used his exceptional powers to issue lists of individuals who were considered enemies of the state and who were to be executed. Many of these were already under detention and were awaiting trials, which they were now afforded. On the 30th of September alone, 58 people were executed and 256 more were sent to Gestapo prisons. This was just the initial bloodletting. By the end of November 1941, over 400 people had been executed and over 6,000 had been arrested. This was a huge security operation, and 1,800 Gestapo officers were employed across the Protectorate by the end of 1941. Many of those arrested were sent to Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp in Upper Austria, where only 4% of those so incarcerated survived the war. But while Heydrich's methods quickly earned him the sobriquet, the Butcher of Prague, they were also effective. By early 1942, the Czech resistance had been depleted considerably, and with the confiscation of dozens of wireless transmitters, political dissidents across the country were robbed of the ability to communicate between isolated resistance cells. Moreover, Heydrich was a shrewd propagandist and tried to buy off much of the Czech populace with labor reforms and the distribution of the largesse from confiscated properties amongst the country's workers. This was, when it came down to it, the main reason why Heydrich was sent there, for the Protectorate was critical to the German war economy, with a major munitions factory at Brno and the Skoda car manufacturing company at Pilsen providing valuable automobiles for the war effort. Heydrich's time as governor of Bohemia and Moravia was a brutal conclusion to what was a brutal career. Hundreds were murdered in the weeks following his arrival, and thousands more were sent off in what was a virtual death sentence to the concentration camps. In addition, Heydrich began forcing tens of thousands of Czech people into what was effectively slave labor. In the first 4 months of 1942, approximately 40,000 Czech laborers were added to a huge list of individuals who were to be forcibly moved from the Protectorate to Germany to make up for manpower shortages in the Reich, as German men were sent in ever-increasing numbers eastwards to Russia. He did all of this with an ideological fervor that was virtually unmatched by any of his colleagues within the Nazi hierarchy. In an address to the Protectorate government on the 19th of January 1942, he stressed that, with a firm hand, he had done more to bring the region under control in 4 months than had been achieved in the previous 2.5 years, and more was to come, he claimed. The next task was to introduce, quote, a correct and unambivalent education of the Czech youth, in an attempt to further Germanize the country. Brutal though his methods were, they were all approved of in Berlin, where the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary, the policy that Heydrich has pursued in the Protectorate can be described as nothing short of exemplary. Given the immediate brutality of Heydrich's governance of Bohemia and Moravia in late 1941 and early 1942, it is unsurprising that it immediately aroused clandestine opposition within the upper ranks of the Czech resistance. Indeed, Heydrich's reputation had preceded him, and already on the 3rd of October 1941, just a week after the man with the iron heart had taken up his position in Prague, the head of the Czech resistance in exile in Britain, Jan Šrámek, and his advisers had determined that they would attempt to assassinate Heydrich. To this end, it was decided to send 2 Czechoslovak resistance fighters, Josef Glabčík and Jan Kubiš, to Bohemia to oversee the mission. Glabčík and Kubiš, who were Slovak and Czech respectively, were in London at the time, but were quickly prepared for the mission, which was codenamed Operation Anthropoid. Then, on the 28th of December 1941, they were flown over the Czech countryside on a British RAF plane before parachuting down to the east of Prague. In the hours that followed, they made contact with the Czech resistance on the ground and began planning how to execute the governor of Bohemia and Moravia. It would be 5 months before they moved against Heydrich. Part of the problem for Glabčík and Kubiš was that Heydrich was often absent from the region. At the time that they parachuted into Bohemia in the dying days of 1941, Heydrich was in the middle of planning the Wannsee Conference, which had been originally scheduled for early December, but which had to be rescheduled following the attack by the Empire of Japan on the US Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which resulted in the entry of the US into the Second World War. Given his myriad duties, it was often the case that Heydrich's routine changed, making planning an attack on him difficult. However, an opportunity presented itself in late May when it was learned that Heydrich was scheduled to fly back to Berlin, where Hitler was proposing to send him to France to take over the occupation government in Paris. The road to the airport contained several tight bends, where the driver of Heydrich's car, Johannes Klein, would have to slow down considerably, and Heydrich had taken to riding around without a security detail in an open car in the warm late spring weather. Having examined the road he would travel on, Glabčík, Kubiš and their associates within the Czech resistance decided on a particular location where the pair would ambush Heydrich's car and assassinate the governor. The date would be the 27th of May, 1942. On the morning of the 27th, Heydrich set off at approximately 10:30 a.m. The location Glabčík and Kubiš had selected for the ambush was near a tight curve on the road Heydrich would be traveling on, and where the car would have to slow down in order to take the turn. As the car neared it that morning, Glabčík emerged from his hiding place and took aim at the vehicle with a Sten submachine gun. However, his gun jammed and failed to fire. Had Heydrich simply ordered Klein to press his foot on the accelerator and get them out of there at that point, then he would have survived the attempt on his life. But instead, Heydrich, who believed Glabčík was acting alone, commanded Klein to slow down and went to draw his Luger pistol to gun the resistance fighter down. It was at this juncture that Kubiš emerged from his hiding place and threw a grenade at Heydrich's car. It bounced somewhat away from the vehicle when it hit it, but the explosion was sufficient, as the blast injured Heydrich in his chest, spleen, ribs and lung. He was, though, still alive, and a shootout followed before Gabčík and Kubiš fled. At this point, Heydrich collapsed by the side of the road as the driver Klein chased after the pair of assailants. As they fled the scene, Gabčík and Kubiš believed that the assassination attempt had failed, but they were wrong. Heydrich was still alive, but in very bad shape. Klein could not make it back to drive him to a hospital, as he had been shot in the leg by Gabčík when he had chased after him. Instead, a Czech woman who had been nearby went to him following the shootout, and a van was flagged down, which transported him to the nearby Bulovka hospital in Prague. There, a splenectomy was performed to remove much of his damaged spleen, along with another operation to debride his lung and diaphragm and treat the chest wound. But it was all to no avail, although his condition seemed to improve in the days that followed, such that he was lucid enough to communicate when Himmler visited on the 2nd of June. On the 3rd, Heydrich fell into a coma and died the following day. The exact cause is not 100% clear, given the range of injuries he had sustained, but it was most likely from sepsis. He was 38 years of age. Perhaps the most curious thing about the assassination was that Heydrich was usually extremely cautious when it came to his personal security. Back in Berlin, the entire Heydrich house was linked by alarm bells to local police stations so that any intruders would be quickly apprehended. When traveling around the German capital, the head of the Reich's security main office had cars fitted with machine guns and pistols in case he was ever attacked in the way Gabčík and Kubiš had ambushed him in Prague. Perhaps most amazingly, Heydrich had been personally responsible for drawing up guidelines for the safety measures which should be followed by senior members of the regime and the Nazi Party during wartime. And, in the weeks leading up to his assassination, the Gestapo and other security services under Heydrich's overall command had received numerous reports that the Czech resistance and other elements amongst the Allies were planning to attempt to assassinate him. One of these had involved the arrest and interrogation of a Russian who had been apprehended in Warsaw on his way to Prague, with a sniper rifle disguised inside a secret compartment of his suitcase. Another report had specifically noted Czech resistance fighters who had parachuted into the country, as Gabčík and Kubiš had. This makes Heydrich's complacency in riding around Prague in an open car without a proper security detail somewhat confounding, but he appears to have viewed it as a political point of principle. A major security presence around him would suggest that he feared the Czechs and would damage his prestige as the iron-fisted governor of the region. If this was his view, it was an ultimately fatal miscalculation on his part. Brutal reprisals were carried out in Bohemia and Moravia in the weeks that followed in response to Heydrich's assassination. At least 1,300 people were arrested, while entire villages were massacred for having the flimsiest of possible links to the resistance. One of these, at the village of Lidice, roughly 20 kilometers outside Prague, resulted in the massacre of nearly 200 civilians, while hundreds more were arrested and sent to the concentration camps where the majority of them died in the months that followed. And the brutal crackdown also resulted in the locating of Gabčík and Kubiš. On the 18th of June 1942, 2 weeks after Heydrich had died in hospital, the pair were cornered, along with several other members of the Czech resistance, in the church of St. Kirill and St. Methodius in Prague. A 6-hour shootout followed, during which dozens of German soldiers were killed or wounded before the church was successfully stormed. Gabčík and several others committed suicide before they were taken alive. Kubiš was wounded by a grenade blast and was unable to kill himself, but he died from his wounds anyway shortly after the Germans entered the building. Even this did not bring the violence to an end, and reprisals against the Czech populace continued for weeks thereafter, as the people of Bohemia and Moravia were made to pay a high price for the assassination of Heydrich. Heydrich was the most high-profile member of the Nazi regime to be assassinated during the Second World War. His funeral was accordingly organized in a lavish fashion, and used extensively for Nazi propaganda purposes. His body was first put on display in the courtyard of Prague Castle on the 7th of June 1942, during which time tens of thousands of Czech citizens were encouraged to pay their respects. From there, his body was transmitted to Berlin, where the main funeral ceremony was held on the 9th of June in the Mosaic Room of the Reich Chancellery. There, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels stage-managed the ceremony to have Hitler and others enter as Richard Wagner's Twilight of the Gods was played. Himmler delivered the eulogy, while Hitler, who privately blamed Heydrich for allowing himself to be assassinated, laid the Blood Order Medal, the highest distinction awarded by the Nazi Party, in Heydrich's coffin. Thereafter, he was buried in the Invalidenfriedhof, a military cemetery in Berlin. Hitler had intended that a giant monument would be erected here after the war, but today Heydrich's grave is unmarked. In the days that followed his funeral, the man who, more than nearly anybody else within the Nazi regime, was responsible for the carrying out of the Holocaust, was lionized by the Nazi media as the perfect Aryan. Heydrich might well have faced the consequences of his heinous actions in the long run anyway, even had he not been killed outside Prague that summer day in 1942, for the Third Reich was doomed. When he arrived to Bohemia and Moravia in the late autumn of 1941, the German war effort seemed infallible. German armies continued to move eastwards with great speed into Russia and towards the cities of Moscow and Leningrad, with the Einsatzgruppen, which Heydrich had been central to establishing, conducting their deadly work behind the front lines. But while Heydrich was presiding over mass executions and arrests in Prague, things soured in Russia in the early winter of 1941. The German advance stalled outside the main cities in the face of the first stringent resistance from the Russians that the Germans had encountered. Then the winter set in, and the logistical preparations of the German Wehrmacht were revealed to have been very poor, as tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or incapacitated by the Russian winter, as they did not have suitable winter clothes to withstand the cold. By the time Heydrich was assassinated in the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had settled down into a stalemate, but the swift German victory that had been obtained in France in 1940 looked ever more elusive. Things got precipitously worse for Germany in the months following Heydrich's death. Hitler's hopes on the Eastern Front rested on gaining victory over the Russians at the southern city of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, an engagement which ended in the spectacular Russian victory in February 1943 and the surrender of the German Sixth Army. The Russians then went on the attack, and the Germans were being pushed back into Ukraine and then Poland throughout 1943 and 1944. Simultaneously, the Western Allies, led by the United States and Britain, opened a southern front in Italy in the summer of 1943, and then a western front in France a year later. Finally, in 1945, the Allies streamed into Germany from west and east. Hitler killed himself in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945, before he could be taken alive, as did other senior Nazis, such as Joseph Goebbels. Germany formally surrendered just over a week later, bringing the war in Europe to a conclusion. In its aftermath, the senior members of the regime and the SS were put on trial at the city of Nuremberg, and most were executed for their crimes thereafter, notably Heydrich's successor as head of the Reich Security Main Office and the SD, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Had he survived, Heydrich would have been presented in 1945 with the choice of suicide, attempting to flee Europe, or standing trial and being executed. Reinhard Heydrich was in many ways the vilest of all the Nazis, an individual who oversaw the extension of genocidal policies and mass murder across the continent of Europe during the Second World War. What is perhaps slightly strange about this is that his rise to his position was in many ways so mundane. From a very young age, he had exhibited anti-Semitic tendencies, which were perhaps exacerbated by having been criticized by his peers as a teenager on account of his own alleged Jewish ancestry. But as he grew into his adult years, he did not act on these in any overt way, and his career trajectory throughout the 1920s was relatively conventional for an aspiring naval officer. However, this rather routine development was thrown out of kilter in 1931 when he was simultaneously expelled from the German Navy and then introduced into the upper echelons of the Nazi Party by his soon-to-be wife. From there, once Heinrich Himmler realized that Heydrich had an unusual talent for counterintelligence and security services work, a species of bureaucratic demon was effectively in the fashioning, one whose actions were so calculated and emotionless that even Adolf Hitler would come to refer to him as the man with the iron heart. The crimes Heydrich committed over the next 10 years down to his death are hard to enumerate. As successively head of the SD, the Gestapo, and then the Reich Security Main Office, he was responsible for arresting and terrorizing tens of thousands of people throughout Germany during the 1930s, a practice which was extended to countries like Austria as the Reich began expanding from 1938 onwards. Once the war began, he oversaw Operation Tannenberg, whereby tens of thousands of Poles were executed and murdered without trial or due process. Already at this stage, he was involved in the operations of the Einsatzgruppen, which would go on to murder approximately 2 million people in Eastern Europe during the war. Then, in the course of 1941, Heydrich was heavily involved with others from within the Reich Security Main Office in developing the final solution, whereby millions of Europe's Jews would be mass murdered in the concentration camp system which had been developed across Central and Eastern Europe. It was Heydrich who organized and oversaw the conference at Wannsee in January 1942, where details of what would become the Holocaust were transmitted to several senior bureaucrats of the Reich, and the terrible process was initiated. Bizarrely, Heydrich's ruthless and brutal crackdown on political dissent during his brief term as governor of Bohemia and Moravia almost seems like a footnote to his career when judged against everything else that it involved. Given all of this, it is entirely safe to say that Reinhard Heydrich represented the epitome of the evil that was the Third Reich. What do you think of Reinhard Heydrich? Was he the perfect Nazi, and were the Allies justified in plotting his assassination? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.